The night at St. Andrew's Hospital was unusually quiet. The fluorescent lights in the hallways cast a sterile glow, illuminating the polished floors, and the occasional shadow of a nurse or doctor moving briskly from one room to another. The hum of machines, the soft beeping of monitors, and the occasional murmur of voices were the only sounds that broke the stillness. It was a calm that felt fragile, as though the hospital itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. In the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, the atmosphere was even more tense. Here, the tiniest and most vulnerable lives clung to existence, their survival dependent on the relentless efforts of the medical staff and the machines that surrounded them. Inside one of the glass chambers, a baby lay motionless, her small chest rising and falling with the help of a ventilator. Tubes and wires connected her fragile body to monitors that tracked every heartbeat, every breath, every flicker of life. The baby's condition was critical, and despite the best efforts of the doctors and nurses, her chances of survival seemed to dwindle with each passing hour. Nurse Emily stood by the baby's crib, her face etched with exhaustion and worry. She had been caring for this child for weeks, watching helplessly as the baby's condition fluctuated between moments of hope and despair. Tonight, the monitors displayed erratic readings, a grim reminder of how precarious the situation was. Emily adjusted the baby's blanket, her fingers trembling slightly. She had seen too many nights like this, where the line between life and death felt impossibly thin. As Emily stepped away to check on another patient, the automatic doors at the hospital's main entrance slid open with a soft hiss. A figure entered, moving quietly and purposefully. It wasn't a doctor or a nurse, nor was it a visitor. It was a dog, a golden retriever with a coat that shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights. His soft brown eyes scanned the hallway with an intensity that seemed almost human. He moved with a quiet confidence, his nails clicking lightly against the polished floor. No one noticed him at first. The few staff members who caught a glimpse of him assumed he was a therapy dog, perhaps brought in to comfort a patient. Others thought he might be a stray who had wandered in by accident. But the dog, later known as Lucky, was no ordinary visitor. He wasn't aimlessly wandering the hospital halls. He had a purpose, though no one could have guessed what it was. Lucky padded through the corridors, his movements deliberate and precise. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, as if drawn by an invisible force. He passed the reception desk, where a tired clerk was too absorbed in paperwork to notice him. He walked by the waiting area, where a man sat with his head in his hands, lost in his own worries. Lucky didn't stop or hesitate. His focus was unwavering. As he approached the NICU, a nurse exiting the unit paused for a moment, her eyes meeting Lucky's. She frowned slightly as if trying to place where she had seen him before, but then shook her head and continued on her way. Lucky slipped through the doors just as they were closing, his movements so smooth and quiet that no one inside noticed his arrival. The NICU was a world of its own, filled with the soft hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. The air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic, and the dim lighting added to the somber atmosphere. Lucky moved carefully, his paws making almost no sound on the tiled floor. He stopped in front of the glass chamber where the baby lay, his eyes softening as he looked at her. For a moment, Lucky stood still, as if assessing the situation. Then, with a gentle nudge of his nose, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. He approached the baby's crib, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he understood the fragility of the life before him. He lay down beside the crib, curling up as close as the equipment would allow. His golden fur seemed to glow in the dim light, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment around him. The monitors continued their steady beeping, but something about the room felt different. The air seemed lighter, less oppressive. Lucky's presence, though uninvited and unexplained, brought a sense of calm that was almost palpable. It was as if the dog carried with him a quiet reassurance, a promise that everything would be okay. Back at the nurse's station, Emily rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue that weighed heavily on her. She glanced at the clock, noting that her shift was far from over. She thought about the baby in the NICU, her heart aching with a mix of hope and despair. She had done everything she could, but it never felt like enough. As she stood there, lost in thought, a strange feeling tugged at the back of her mind. Something was different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the air around her felt lighter. Deciding to check on the baby one more time, Emily made her way back to the NICU. As she entered the room, Her eyes were immediately drawn to the golden shape curled up beside the crib. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. There, lying peacefully next to the baby, was the golden retriever. For a moment she thought she was imagining things. How had the dog gotten in? And why was he here? Her first instinct was to shoo him away, to call security and have him removed from the sterile environment. But something stopped her. The baby's monitors, which had been erratic all night, now displayed steady readings. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell in a rhythm that was almost peaceful. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Could it be a coincidence? Or was the dog somehow helping? She approached the crib cautiously, her eyes never leaving the dog. Lucky lifted his head as she drew near, his eyes calm and steady. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He simply watched her as if to say, "I'm here for her." Emily knelt beside the crib, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the baby's hand. The tiny fingers twitched under her touch, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. This was no ordinary dog, and this was no ordinary night. Lucky's presence was a mystery, one that Emily couldn't begin to explain. But in that moment, she didn't need answers. She only needed to trust her instincts, which told her to let him stay. Something about him felt right, as though he belonged here, by this child's side. As the night wore on, Emily stayed close, her eyes flicking between the sleeping dog and the fragile infant. She didn't know what connection existed between them, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope. The hospital, usually a place of cold logic and science, had become the setting for something extraordinary. And though no one could explain it, Emily knew deep down that Lucky's arrival was no accident. The hospital corridors stretched long and empty, their silence broken only by the occasional squeak of a nurse's shoes or the distant hum of machinery. The air was cool, sterile, and heavy with the weight of unspoken worries. Lucky, the golden retriever, moved through these halls with a quiet determination. His golden coat shimmered faintly under the fluorescent lights, and his soft brown eyes, filled with an almost human-like focus, scanned his surroundings as if searching for something or someone. Lucky's movements were deliberate, purposeful. He wasn't wandering aimlessly like a lost dog. He walked with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they needed to be. His nails clicked softly against the polished floor, a rhythmic sound that seemed to echo in the stillness of the night. Occasionally he would pause, his nose twitching as he caught a scent or his ears perking up at a distant sound. But he never lingered for long. There was an urgency in his steps, a silent mission that only he seemed to understand. As Lucky turned a corner, he passed a nurse who was leaning against the wall, rubbing her temples after a long shift. She glanced at him briefly, her tired eyes registering his presence but not questioning it. Perhaps she thought he was a therapy dog, brought in to comfort patients or staff. Therapy dogs weren't uncommon in hospitals after all, and Lucky's calm demeanor and golden fur gave him an air of reassurance. The nurse let out a small sigh and returned to her thoughts, dismissing the dog as just another part of the hospital's quiet night. Further down the hall, Lucky passed a group of doctors in white coats, their voices low as they discussed a patient's case. One of them noticed the dog and raised an eyebrow, but before he could say anything, Lucky had already moved on, his tail swishing gently behind him. The doctors exchanged puzzled glances but quickly returned to their conversation. There was no time to worry about a stray dog when lives were at stake. Lucky continued his journey, weaving through the labyrinth of hallways with an uncanny sense of direction. He passed the waiting area, where a man sat slumped in a chair, his face buried in his hands. The man didn't notice the dog, too consumed by his own worries to look up. Lucky paused for a moment, his head tilting slightly as if he could sense the man's pain. But then, as if reminded of his purpose, he resumed his steady pace, his focus unshaken. The hospital's automatic doors opened and closed with soft hisses as staff moved in and out of various rooms. Lucky approached one such door, his nose twitching as he caught a faint, familiar scent. It was the scent of life, fragile, struggling, but still fighting. His ears perked up, and his steps quickened slightly. He had found what he was looking for. The door to the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, loomed ahead, its glass panels revealing a world of tiny cribs, blinking monitors, and the soft glow of medical equipment. Inside, the smallest and most vulnerable patients fought battles they couldn't even comprehend, their lives hanging by a thread. Lucky stopped in front of the door, his head tilting slightly as he peered through the glass. His eyes softened, and for a moment he stood perfectly still, as if gathering his resolve. A nurse exiting the NICU noticed Lucky and paused, her hand still on the door. She frowned slightly, her tired mind trying to make sense of the dog's presence. "Where did you come from?" she murmured under her breath. But Lucky didn't respond, of course. He simply looked at her with those calm, steady eyes, and something about his gaze made her hesitate. She shook her head, dismissing the thought, and let the door close behind her. Lucky seized the opportunity, slipping through the door just before it shut completely. Inside the NICU, the atmosphere was heavy with a mix of hope and despair. The rhythmic beeping of monitors filled the air, each sound a reminder of the fragile lives they were monitoring. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of machines casting long shadows on the walls. Lucky moved carefully, his paws making almost no sound on the tiled floor. He seemed to understand the gravity of the space he had entered, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of a crib, his eyes locking onto the tiny figure lying inside. The baby was motionless, her small chest rising and falling with the help of a ventilator. Tubes and wires connected her to the machines that kept her alive, their blinking lights a stark contrast to her pale, fragile form. Lucky's gaze softened even further as he looked at her, his head tilting slightly as if he could sense her struggle. For a moment, Lucky stood still, his golden fur glowing faintly in the dim light. Then, with a gentle nudge of his nose, he pushed the crib's side slightly, as if to reassure himself that the baby was real. He circled the crib once, his movements slow and careful, before settling down beside it. He curled up as close to the crib as the equipment would allow, his body forming a protective barrier around the tiny life inside. The monitors continued their steady beeping, but something about the room felt different. The air seemed lighter, less oppressive. Lucky's presence, though uninvited and unexplained, brought a sense of calm that was almost tangible. It was as if the dog carried with him a quiet reassurance, a promise that everything would be okay. Back at the nurse's station, one of the staff glanced at the NICU's monitor feed and noticed the golden shape curled up beside the crib. "Is that a dog?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Another nurse looked up from her paperwork and squinted at the screen. "Must be a therapy dog," she said dismissively. "They bring them in sometimes for the kids." The first nurse frowned but didn't press the issue. There were more pressing matters to attend to, and the dog didn't seem to be causing any harm. Meanwhile, Lucky remained by the crib, his breathing slow and steady. The baby's monitors, which had been erratic earlier, now displayed more stable readings. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Lucky's presence seemed to have a calming effect, not just on the baby, but on the entire room. The soft glow of the machines felt less harsh, the beeping less urgent. It was as if the dog had brought a piece of the outside world into the sterile confines of the NICU, a world of warmth, comfort, and quiet strength. As the night wore on, Lucky didn't move from his spot. He lay there, his eyes occasionally flickering open to check on the baby, his ears twitching at the faint sounds of the monitors. He was a silent guardian, a golden beacon of hope in a place where hope was often hard to find. And though no one could explain how or why he had come to be there, one thing was certain: Lucky was exactly where he needed to be. The NICU was a place where every second mattered, where the smallest changes could mean the difference between life and death. The rhythmic beeping of monitors filled the air, a constant reminder of the fragile lives that depended on the machines. Tonight, however, something unusual was happening. The steady hum of the machines seemed softer, less urgent, as if the room itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled a sense of calm. And at the center of it all was Lucky, the golden retriever, lying quietly beside the crib of the critically ill baby. The baby, who had been in a precarious state for weeks, was now showing signs of improvement. Her heart rate, which had been erratic and unstable, began to even out. The jagged lines on the monitor smoothed into a steady rhythm, and the alarming spikes that had kept the medical staff on edge all night began to subside. The ventilator, which had been working overtime to assist her breathing, now seemed to be in sync with her tiny, fragile lungs. It was a subtle change, but for anyone who had been monitoring her condition, it was nothing short of miraculous. Lucky lay still, his golden fur glowing faintly under the dim lights of the NICU. His presence was calm and unassuming, yet it seemed to radiate a quiet strength. His soft brown eyes were half closed, but his ears twitched occasionally, as if he were listening to the baby's breathing. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his very presence seemed to fill the room with a sense of peace. It was as if he understood the gravity of the situation, as if he knew that his role was to simply be there, to offer comfort and reassurance in a way that no human could. Meanwhile, Nurse Emily was finishing her rounds in another part of the hospital. She had been caring for the baby in the NICU for months, watching helplessly as the child's condition fluctuated between moments of hope and despair. Emily had poured her heart into her work, staying late on countless nights, holding the baby's tiny hand when no one else was there. She had seen too many nights like this, where the machine seemed to be the only thing keeping the baby alive. Tonight, she had left the NICU feeling a familiar sense of helplessness, her heart heavy with worry. As she walked back toward the NICU, Emily felt a strange sense of unease. It wasn't the usual anxiety that came with working in such a high-stakes environment. This was different, a feeling she couldn't quite put into words. Something was off. She quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty hallway. When she reached the door to the NICU, she paused for a moment, her hand hovering over the handle. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The sight that greeted her stopped her in her tracks. There, lying beside the baby's crib, was a dog, a golden retriever to be exact. His golden coat shimmered faintly under the soft glow of the monitors, and his body was curled protectively around the base of the crib. For a moment, Emily thought she was imagining things. How had a dog gotten into the NICU? And why was he lying next to the baby? Her first instinct was to call security, to have the dog removed immediately. After all, this was a sterile environment, and the presence of an animal was a clear violation of hospital protocol. But then Emily's eyes shifted to the monitors, and her breath caught in her throat. The baby's heart rate, which had been dangerously unstable just hours ago, was now steady. The erratic beeping that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by a calm, rhythmic sound. The oxygen levels, which had been fluctuating wildly, were now within a normal range. Emily blinked, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. She had been monitoring this baby's condition for weeks, and she knew how dire it had been. This kind of improvement didn't just happen, not without some kind of intervention. Her eyes flicked back to the dog. He was lying perfectly still, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed. He didn't seem to notice her presence, or if he did, he didn't react. There was something almost otherworldly about him, something that made Emily hesitate. She took a cautious step forward, her gaze shifting between the dog and the baby. The monitors continued their steady beeping, a sound that now felt almost soothing. Emily knelt beside the crib, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand. The baby's skin, which had been pale and cool to the touch, now felt warm. Her tiny fingers twitched under Emily's touch, a small but unmistakable sign of life. Emily's heart swelled with a mix of relief and disbelief. She had seen countless cases in her career, but she had never witnessed anything like this. She turned her attention back to the dog. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucky lifted his head slightly, his soft brown eyes meeting hers. There was something in his gaze that made Emily pause. It wasn't the look of a stray dog or even a trained therapy animal. It was something deeper, something that felt almost knowing. Emily couldn't explain it, but in that moment she felt an overwhelming sense of trust. This dog, whoever he was, wasn't here by accident. Emily stood up slowly, her mind racing. She knew she should call someone, report the dog's presence, but something stopped her. The baby's condition had improved. There was no denying that. And while she couldn't explain how or why, she couldn't ignore the possibility that the dog had something to do with it. For now, she decided to let him stay. If his presence was helping the baby, then who was she to question it? As the night wore on, Emily kept a close eye on both the baby and the dog. She watched as Lucky remained by the crib, his body relaxed but his eyes alert. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his presence seemed to fill the room with a sense of calm. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing something extraordinary, something that defied logic and reason. By the time her shift ended, Emily was no closer to understanding what had happened. All she knew was that the baby's condition had improved, and the dog, Lucky, as she would later come to call him, had been there when it happened. As she left the NICU, she glanced back at the crib one last time. Lucky was still there, his golden fur glowing softly in the dim light. Emily didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. And in a place like the NICU, hope was the most precious thing of all. The morning light filtered through the windows of St. Andrew's Hospital, casting a pale glow over the sterile white walls. The NICU was quiet, save for the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional murmur of nurses checking on their tiny patients. Lucky, the golden retriever, was still lying beside the baby's crib, his golden fur glowing faintly in the dim light. His presence had become a source of comfort, not just for the baby but for Nurse Emily, who had spent the night marveling at the baby's sudden improvement. But the peace of the morning was about to be shattered. Dr. Harris, the head of pediatrics, was making his rounds. Known for his strict adherence to rules and his no-nonsense demeanor, Dr. Harris was a man who valued logic and science above all else. He was respected by his colleagues for his skill and dedication, but his rigid personality often left little room for compromise. As he entered the NICU, clipboard in hand, his sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. It didn't take long for him to notice Lucky. Dr. Harris froze mid-step, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the dog lying beside the baby's crib. For a moment he said nothing, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. Then, his voice cut through the quiet like a knife. "What is that dog doing in here?" he demanded, his tone sharp and authoritative. Emily, who had been standing near the baby's crib, turned quickly at the sound of his voice. Her heart sank as she saw the expression on Dr. Harris's face. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that Lucky's presence in the NICU was bound to raise questions, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. "Dr. Harris," she began, her voice calm but tinged with nervousness. "I can explain." "Explain," Dr. Harris interrupted, his voice rising. "There is a dog in the NICU, Nurse Emily. A dog. This is a sterile environment. Do you have any idea how many protocols this violates?" Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She knew Dr. Harris well enough to know that he wouldn't be easily convinced, but she also knew she had to try. Lucky's presence had made a difference. She was sure of it, and she wasn't about to let him be removed without a fight. "Dr. Harris," she said, her voice firm but respectful, "I understand your concerns, but please just hear me out. This dog, his name is Lucky. He's not just any dog. He's been here all night lying beside the baby's crib, and since he arrived, the baby's condition has improved significantly." Dr. Harris raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Improved? Are you seriously suggesting that a dog is responsible for a medical improvement? That's absurd, Nurse Emily. This is a hospital, not a fairy tale." Emily felt a surge of frustration but forced herself to remain calm. "I'm not saying it's something we can explain, Dr. Harris," she said, "but the facts are the facts. The baby's heart rate stabilized, her oxygen levels improved, and her overall condition is better than it's been in weeks. And it all started after Lucky arrived." Dr. Harris shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Correlation does not equal causation," he said firmly. "You're a nurse, Emily. You know better than to jump to conclusions based on anecdotal evidence. Whatever improvement the baby has shown is likely due to the treatment plan we've been following, not the presence of a dog." Emily opened her mouth to argue, but Dr. Harris held up a hand to stop her. "Enough," he said. "This is not up for debate. That dog has no place in this hospital, let alone the NICU. I want him removed immediately." Emily's heart sank. She had expected resistance, but the finality in Dr. Harris's tone left her feeling helpless. She glanced at Lucky, who was still lying quietly beside the crib, his soft brown eyes watching her as if he understood what was happening. The thought of him being taken away, of the baby losing the comfort he provided, filled her with a sense of dread. "Dr. Harris, please," she said, her voice almost pleading. "I know this isn't something we can explain, but I've seen the difference Lucky has made. The baby responds to him in a way I've never seen before. He's not harming anyone. If anything, he's helping. Can't we just give him a chance?" Dr. Harris's expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. "Emily," he said, his tone gentler but still firm, "I understand that you care deeply about your patients. That's one of the reasons you're such a good nurse. But we can't let emotions cloud our judgment. This is a hospital, and we have rules for a reason. Allowing a dog to stay in the NICU sets a dangerous precedent. What happens if something goes wrong? Who will be held responsible?" Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She knew Dr. Harris was only doing what he thought was right, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake. Lucky wasn't just a dog. He was something more, something extraordinary. and she couldn't stand the thought of losing him. "Dr. Harris," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'll take full responsibility. If anything goes wrong, it'll be on me. But please, just give Lucky a chance. Let him stay, at least for a little while longer. If there's no improvement, I'll personally see to it that he's removed. But if there's even a chance that he's helping, isn't it worth it?" Dr. Harris hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. For a moment, Emily thought he might relent, but then he shook his head. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said. "I can't allow it. The risk is too great. The dog has to go." Emily felt a wave of despair wash over her as Dr. Harris turned and walked away, his decision final. She looked back at Lucky, who was still lying beside the crib, his presence as calm and steady as ever. She knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his golden fur. "I'm so sorry, Lucky," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I tried." Lucky looked up at her, his soft brown eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his presence seemed to offer her a sense of comfort, even in the face of defeat. Emily stayed there for a moment, her hand on his fur, her heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. As the morning wore on, the hospital staff began to prepare for Lucky's removal. But deep down, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a mistake. Lucky had brought something to the NICU that no machine or medicine could provide, a sense of hope, a reminder that miracles could happen, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. And as she watched him lying beside the baby's crib, Emily made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't give up, not on the baby, and not on Lucky. No matter what it took, she would find a way to keep him there. Because in her heart, she knew that Lucky wasn't just a dog. He was a lifeline, a beacon of hope in a place that desperately needed it. The day began like any other at St. Andrew's Hospital, but for Nurse Emily, it felt like the end of something precious. Today was the day Lucky, the golden retriever who had brought so much hope to the NICU, was to be removed from the hospital. Despite her best efforts to convince Dr. Harris and the hospital administration to let him stay, the decision had been final. Lucky was to be taken away, and Emily's heart felt heavy with dread. The NICU was unusually quiet that morning, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Lucky lay beside the baby's crib, his golden fur glowing faintly under the soft light of the monitors. He had been there for days, his presence a source of comfort and calm for everyone who entered the room. But now, as the hospital staff prepared to escort him out, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a terrible mistake. The baby, who had shown remarkable improvement since Lucky's arrival, seemed stable for now. Her heart rate was steady, her oxygen levels normal. But Emily couldn't ignore the nagging worry in the back of her mind. She had seen too many cases where a fragile recovery could turn in an instant. And as she watched Lucky lying peacefully beside the crib, she couldn't help but wonder if his presence had been the reason for the baby's progress. The sound of footsteps broke the silence, and Emily turned to see two hospital staff members entering the NICU. One of them carried a leash, the other a clipboard. They approached Lucky cautiously, their movements hesitant as if they too felt the weight of what they were about to do. "It's time," one of them said softly, avoiding Emily's gaze. Emily knelt beside Lucky, her hand resting gently on his fur. "I'm so sorry, Lucky," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I tried to fight for you, I really did." Lucky lifted his head, his soft brown eyes meeting hers. There was no fear or resistance in his gaze, only a quiet understanding. It was as if he knew what was happening and had accepted it. Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she stood and stepped back, allowing the staff to take him. As they led Lucky out of the NICU, the room felt emptier, colder. Emily watched him go, her heart aching with a sense of loss she couldn't explain. She turned back to the baby's crib, her eyes scanning the monitors. Everything seemed fine, for now. But the unease in her chest refused to go away. Hours passed and the NICU settled into its usual rhythm. Nurses moved quietly between cribs, checking on their tiny patients, while the soft beeping of monitors filled the air. Emily tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to Lucky. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they had made a mistake by removing him. And then it happened. The baby's monitor let out a sharp, piercing alarm, shattering the quiet of the NICU. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she rushed to the crib. The baby's heart rate had plummeted, her oxygen levels dropping dangerously low. The once steady beeping of the monitor had turned into a frantic, erratic sound that sent a wave of panic through the room. "Code Blue!" Emily shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Within seconds, the NICU was a flurry of activity. Doctors and nurses crowded around the crib, their faces tense as they worked to stabilize the baby. Dr. Harris was among them, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a look of grim determination. "Her heart rate is crashing," one of the doctors said, his voice urgent. "We're losing her." Emily stood frozen, her hands trembling as she watched the scene unfold. The baby, who had been stable just hours ago, was now fighting for her life. The machines that had been her lifeline were no longer enough. Emily felt a wave of helplessness wash over her, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. Dr. Harris barked orders, his voice sharp and commanding. "Increase the oxygen flow. Prepare for intubation. We need to get her stabilized now." But nothing seemed to work. The baby's condition continued to deteriorate, her tiny body struggling against the odds. The room was filled with the sound of alarms and hurried footsteps, but to Emily, it all felt distant, like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. And then, just as the situation seemed hopeless, something extraordinary happened. The door to the NICU swung open, and there he was, Lucky. His golden fur was slightly disheveled, and his soft brown eyes were filled with a quiet determination. He moved quickly but calmly, his nails clicking softly against the tiled floor as he made his way to the baby's crib. "Who let that dog back in here?" Dr. Harris demanded, his voice filled with anger and disbelief. But Lucky didn't stop. He slipped past the doctors and nurses, his movements smooth and deliberate. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she watched him approach the crib. There was something almost otherworldly about him, a sense of purpose that no one could deny. "Wait," Emily said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Just wait." Dr. Harris turned to her, his expression incredulous. "Are you serious? This is a medical emergency, Nurse Emily. We don't have time for—" "Just give him a chance," Emily pleaded, her eyes locked on Lucky. "Please." Dr. Harris hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced between Emily and the baby. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. And then, to everyone's astonishment, he stepped back, allowing Lucky to approach the crib. Lucky stood on his hind legs, his front paws resting gently on the edge of the crib. He lowered his head, his nose brushing against the baby's tiny hand. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The monitors continued their frantic beeping, the baby's condition still critical. And then slowly, the beeping began to change. The erratic rhythm of the heart monitor smoothed into a steady beat. The baby's oxygen levels, which had been dangerously low, began to climb. The alarms that had filled the room fell silent, replaced by the soft, reassuring hum of the machines. The baby's tiny chest, which had been struggling to rise and fall, now moved with a calm, steady rhythm. Emily felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the transformation. The baby, who had been on the brink of death just moments ago, was now stable. And at the center of it all was Lucky, his golden fur glowing softly in the dim light of the NICU. Dr. Harris stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. I don't understand," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Emily knelt beside Lucky, her hand resting gently on his fur. "You don't have to understand," she said softly. "Sometimes things happen that we can't explain, and sometimes we just have to believe." Lucky turned his head, his soft brown eyes meeting hers. In that moment, Emily knew that he wasn't just a dog. He was something more, something extraordinary. And as she looked at the baby, now sleeping peacefully in her crib, she felt a renewed sense of hope. Because in a place where miracles were rare, Lucky had brought one to life. The atmosphere at St. Andrew's Hospital had shifted. What had once been a place of strict rules and sterile routines now carried an air of cautious wonder. Lucky, the golden retriever who had defied all logic and protocol, had become the center of attention. His miraculous return to the NICU and the baby's sudden recovery had left everyone, from nurses to doctors, questioning what they thought they knew about medicine, science, and the unexplainable. For Emily, the change was palpable. She had always believed in Lucky, even when others doubted him. But now, as she walked through the hospital halls, she could see the way her colleagues looked at her, and at Lucky, with a newfound respect. The skepticism that had once clouded their faces was now replaced with curiosity, and in some cases, awe. It was as if Lucky had brought not just hope to the NICU, but a sense of belief in something greater. Dr. Harris, who had been the most vocal critic of Lucky's presence, was perhaps the most affected by the events of that fateful day. He had always prided himself on his logical, evidence-based approach to medicine. But watching the baby's condition stabilize after Lucky's return had shaken him to his core. He couldn't explain it, and that lack of explanation gnawed at him. In the days that followed, Dr. Harris found himself observing Lucky from a distance. The dog had been allowed to stay temporarily thanks to Emily's relentless advocacy, but only under strict conditions. Lucky was confined to the NICU and his presence was closely monitored. Dr. Harris had initially agreed to this arrangement reluctantly, but as he watched the baby's health continue to improve, he began to question his own doubts. The baby, who had been on the brink of death just days ago, was now thriving. Her heart rate was steady, her oxygen levels were normal, and her tiny body seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The improvement was undeniable, and it coincided perfectly with Lucky's presence. Dr. Harris couldn't ignore the correlation, no matter how much he wanted to. One afternoon, as he stood outside the NICU watching Lucky lying beside the baby's crib, Dr. Harris turned to Emily, who was standing nearby. "I don't understand it," he admitted, his voice low. "There's no scientific explanation for what's happening here, but I can't deny the results." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with relief. "Sometimes, Dr. Harris, it's not about understanding. It's about believing. Lucky has a connection with her. I don't know how or why, but it's real, and it's helping her." Dr. Harris nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe there are things we can't explain. But if this dog is truly helping her, then we need to do everything we can to support it." With Dr. Harris's tentative support, Emily felt emboldened to take her case to the hospital's leadership. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Allowing a dog to stay in a hospital, especially in a sensitive area like the NICU, was unprecedented. But she also knew that Lucky was no ordinary dog. He had proven himself in ways that no one could deny, and Emily was determined to make sure he could stay. The meeting with the hospital board was tense. The room was filled with senior administrators, all of whom were skeptical about the idea of allowing a dog to remain in the NICU. They cited concerns about hygiene, liability, and the potential for setting a dangerous precedent. But Emily stood her ground, presenting her case with a mix of passion and evidence. "Lucky has been with the baby for days now," she said, her voice steady but firm. "In that time, her condition has improved dramatically. Her heart rate, oxygen levels, and overall health have stabilized in ways we didn't think were possible. I know it sounds unbelievable, but the results speak for themselves. Lucky is helping her in a way that no medicine or machine can." One of the board members, an older man with a stern expression, leaned forward. "Nurse Emily," he said, his tone skeptical. "Are you suggesting that this dog has some kind of healing power?" Emily hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not saying it's something magical," she said, "but I do believe that Lucky has a unique connection with the baby. Maybe it's his presence, his calm energy, or something we don't fully understand, but whatever it is, it's working. And I think we owe it to her, and to him, to let it continue." The room fell silent as the board members exchanged glances. Finally, the chairman spoke. "We'll allow Lucky to stay," he said, his voice measured, "but only under strict conditions. He must remain in the NICU at all times, and his presence will be closely monitored. If there are any issues, we'll revisit this decision." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You won't regret this." With the board's approval, Lucky became an official, albeit unconventional, part of the NICU. His presence brought a sense of calm and hope to everyone who entered the room. Nurses and doctors alike began to notice the way the baby responded to him. When Lucky was near, her heart rate remained steady, her breathing even. It was as if his very presence gave her the strength to keep fighting. Word of Lucky's story began to spread throughout the hospital, and soon, beyond its walls. Patients, staff, and even visitors would stop by the NICU, peering through the glass to catch a glimpse of the golden dog who had captured everyone's hearts. For many, Lucky became a symbol of hope, a reminder that miracles could happen, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. As the days turned into weeks, the baby's condition continued to improve. Her once fragile body grew stronger, her tiny hands gripping Emily's finger with surprising strength. The monitors that had once been a source of constant anxiety now displayed steady, reassuring numbers. And through it all, Lucky remained by her side, his golden fur a constant presence in the NICU. Emily often found herself sitting beside the crib, watching Lucky and the baby with a sense of wonder. She couldn't explain what was happening, but she didn't need to. All that mattered was that the baby was getting better, and Lucky was a part of that. The transformation in the hospital was undeniable. Doctors and nurses who had once dismissed Lucky as a distraction now spoke of him with respect and admiration. Even Dr. Harris, who had been the most vocal critic, had softened. He often stopped by the NICU not to question Lucky's presence, but simply to observe. One evening, as Emily was finishing her shift, Dr. Harris approached her. "You were right," he said quietly, "about Lucky. I don't know how or why, but he's making a difference. And I think we've all learned something from this." Emily smiled, her heart full. "Sometimes it's not about what we can prove," she said. "It's about what we can feel. Lucky has shown us that there's more to healing than just medicine. Sometimes it's about connection, love, and hope." Dr. Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. Maybe we all needed a reminder of that. As Emily looked back at Lucky, lying peacefully beside the baby's crib, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had changed everything, not just for the baby, but for everyone at St. Andrew's Hospital. And in a world that often felt cold and clinical, Lucky had brought something priceless, a reason to believe. The atmosphere in the hospital had grown tense. What had once been a quiet, almost unnoticed presence of Lucky, the golden retriever, had now become a point of contention. While many patients and staff had grown fond of the dog, the hospital leadership, led by Dr. Harris, was far from convinced. Dr. Harris, a man known for his strict adherence to rules and evidence-based practices, had been vocal about his disapproval of Lucky's presence. "This is a hospital, not a petting zoo," he had said during a recent staff meeting, his voice sharp and unwavering. "We cannot allow an animal to roam the halls without scientific evidence proving its benefit. This is a place of medicine, not sentimentality." The words stung Emily, Lucky's handler and the nurse who had brought him into the hospital. She had seen firsthand the positive impact Lucky had on patients. The way their faces lit up when he entered the room, the way their anxiety seemed to melt away as they stroked his soft fur, and the way even the most withdrawn patients opened up in his presence. To Emily, Lucky wasn't just a dog, he was a healer in his own right. But Dr. Harris wasn't alone in his skepticism. Several members of the hospital board had raised concerns about liability, hygiene, and the lack of formal studies supporting the use of therapy dogs in their facility. What if someone is allergic? What if the dog bites someone? What if this becomes a legal nightmare, they argued. Emily felt the weight of their objections pressing down on her. She had always been a rule follower, someone who respected authority and worked within the system, but this time, she couldn't back down. Lucky had already proven his worth to her and to the patients. She just needed to convince everyone else. The turning point came during a meeting with the hospital leadership. Emily had been summoned to defend her decision to bring Lucky into the hospital. She sat at the long conference table, her palms sweaty and her heart racing. Across from her sat Dr. Harris and several board members, their expressions a mix of skepticism and impatience. "Miss Carter," Dr. Harris began, his tone formal and cold, "we've reviewed your request to allow Lucky to remain in the hospital. Unfortunately, we find no compelling evidence to support this. Therapy dogs may be a growing trend, but this hospital operates on science, not trends." Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. "With all due respect, Dr. Harris, I've seen the impact Lucky has on our patients. Just last week, Mrs. Thompson, who hasn't spoken a word since her stroke, smiled and said, 'Good boy,' when Lucky visited her. And Mr. Patel, who's been battling severe depression, told me that Lucky's visits are the only thing he looks forward to. These aren't isolated incidents. Lucky is making a difference." Dr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "Anecdotes, Miss Carter. Stories are not data. We need hard evidence, peer-reviewed studies, and approval from regulatory bodies. Until then, Lucky's presence here is a liability." Emily clenched her fists under the table. "I understand the need for evidence, but we can't ignore what's happening right in front of us. Lucky is helping people. Isn't that what we're here to do? To help our patients in any way we can?" The room fell silent for a moment. Some of the board members exchanged glances, their expressions softening slightly. But Dr. Harris remained unmoved. "This isn't about sentiment, Miss Carter," he said. "It's about protocol. If you insist on keeping Lucky here, you'll need to take full responsibility for him. That includes any incidents, complaints, or legal issues that may arise. Are you prepared to do that?" The weight of Dr. Harris's words hung heavy in the air. Emily knew what he was asking. By taking full responsibility for Lucky, she was putting her career on the line. If anything went wrong, She would be the one to face the consequences. But as she thought about the patients who had already benefited from Lucky's presence, she knew she couldn't back down. She couldn't let bureaucracy and fear stand in the way of something so profoundly good. "I'll take full responsibility," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "If anything goes wrong, it's on me, but I won't let Lucky be taken away from the people who need him." Dr. Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said after a long pause. "But understand this, Miss Carter. If there's even a single incident, Lucky will be removed from the hospital immediately. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Dr. Harris," Emily replied. Word of Emily's decision spread quickly through the hospital. Some of her colleagues admired her courage, while others thought she was being reckless. "You're really putting your job on the line for a dog?" one nurse asked her. "It's not just about the dog," Emily replied. "It's about what he represents. Hope, comfort, and healing. That's worth fighting for." Lucky, of course, was oblivious to the controversy surrounding him. He continued to do what he did best, bringing joy and comfort to everyone he met. Patients lit up when he entered their rooms, and even some of the more skeptical staff members found themselves smiling when Lucky wagged his tail at them. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She knew Dr. Harris and the board were waiting for her to slip up, for Lucky to cause a problem that would justify their decision to remove him. The pressure was immense, but Emily refused to let it break her. One day, as Emily was making her rounds with Lucky, she encountered Dr. Harris in the hallway. He was speaking with a young boy who had been admitted for a serious illness. The boy looked pale and scared, clutching a stuffed animal tightly to his chest. Without thinking, Lucky trotted over to the boy and gently nuzzled his hand. The boy's face lit up, and for the first time since his admission, he smiled. Dr. Harris watched the interaction in silence, his expression softening ever so slightly. He didn't say anything to Emily, but as he walked away, she thought she saw a hint of approval in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Emily knew the battle was far from over. There would be more meetings, more objections, and more pressure to remove Lucky from the hospital. But she also knew she wasn't alone. The patients, their families, and even some of her colleagues were on her side. As she watched Lucky curl up at the foot of a patient's bed, his tail wagging gently, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it, no matter the cost. Because sometimes the things that matter most aren't the ones that can be measured or proven. Sometimes they're the things that touch our hearts and remind us why we do what we do. And for Emily, Lucky was one of those things. The hospital was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that made every sound seem amplified. Emily walked through the halls with Lucky by her side, his golden fur gleaming under the soft fluorescent lights. It had been weeks since Lucky had first arrived at the hospital, and in that time, he had become a beacon of hope for patients and staff alike. But today felt different. There was an air of anticipation, as if something extraordinary was about to happen. Emily's thoughts were focused on the baby in the pediatric intensive care unit. The infant, a tiny boy named Noah, had been in a coma since birth. His parents, Sarah and Michael, had been by his side every day, holding his little hand, whispering words of love and encouragement, and praying for a miracle. The doctors had done everything they could, but Noah's condition remained unchanged. The staff had grown attached to the family, and everyone in the hospital silently hoped for a breakthrough. Lucky had taken a special interest in Noah. Every time Emily brought him into the pediatric ward, Lucky would pull gently on his leash, guiding her toward Noah's crib. He would sit quietly beside the baby, his warm brown eyes watching over him as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Sarah and Michael had come to see Lucky as a source of comfort, a reminder that they weren't alone in their struggle. That morning, as Emily and Lucky entered the pediatric ward, they were greeted by the usual smiles and waves from the nurses, but there was also a sense of urgency in the air. One of the nurses, Linda, approached Emily with wide eyes. "You need to come to Noah's room," Linda said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Something's happening." Emily felt her heart skip a beat. She looked down at Lucky, who seemed unusually alert. His ears perked up as if he too sensed the importance of the moment. Together, they hurried to Noah's room. When they arrived, Emily saw Sarah and Michael standing by the crib, their faces a mixture of disbelief and joy. Sarah was crying, her hands covering her mouth, while Michael stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the tiny figure in the crib. Emily stepped closer and gasped. Noah's eyes were open. For the first time since his birth, The baby was awake. His big, curious eyes blinked slowly as he looked around the room, taking in the faces of his parents and the soft glow of the morning light streaming through the window. It was a moment so profound that it seemed to stop time. The monitors beeped steadily, a reassuring rhythm that underscored the miracle unfolding before them. Sarah reached into the crib, her hands trembling as she gently touched Noah's cheek. "Hi, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Hi, my sweet boy." Michael finally moved, leaning down to kiss his son's forehead. "You're awake," he said, his voice thick with tears. "You're really awake." Emily felt tears welling up in her own eyes. She glanced down at Lucky, who was sitting quietly beside the crib, his tail wagging slowly. It was as if he understood the significance of the moment, as if he had been waiting for this all along. The news of Noah's awakening spread quickly through the hospital. Doctors and nurses came to the room, their faces lighting up with amazement and joy. It was a rare and beautiful moment, a reminder of why they had chosen to dedicate their lives to healing. For a brief time, the weight of their daily struggles was lifted, replaced by the pure, unfiltered happiness of witnessing a miracle. As the day went on, Emily noticed a change in Lucky. He seemed more subdued, less eager to visit other patients. Instead, he stayed close to Noah's room, lying quietly by the door as if standing guard. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Lucky knew his work here was done. Later that evening, as the hospital began to settle into its usual rhythm, Emily took Lucky outside for a walk. The cool evening air was refreshing, and the stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Lucky walked beside her, his steps slow and deliberate. He seemed deep in thought, if such a thing were possible for a dog. "You did something amazing today," Emily said softly, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You helped bring a miracle to life." Lucky looked up at her, his warm brown eyes filled with a quiet wisdom that never failed to amaze her. He wagged his tail gently as if to say, "I know." Over the next few days, Lucky's behavior continued to change. He still greeted patients and staff with his usual warmth, but there was a sense of finality in his actions, as if he were saying goodbye. Emily began to notice that he would often sit by the hospital's main entrance, staring out at the world beyond. It was as if he was waiting for something, or someone. One afternoon, as Emily was finishing her shift, she found Lucky sitting by the entrance again. She knelt down beside him, her heart heavy with the realization that had been forming in her mind. "Are you ready to go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucky turned to look at her, his eyes calm and steady. He licked her hand gently, a gesture of reassurance. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. She had always known that Lucky's presence in the hospital was temporary, that he had come into their lives for a reason, but the thought of letting him go was almost too much to bear. The next morning, Emily brought Lucky to the hospital one last time. She took him to see Noah, who was now alert and responsive, his tiny hands reaching out to touch the world around him. Sarah and Michael were overjoyed, their gratitude to Lucky and Emily evident in every word and gesture. "Thank you," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face as she knelt beside Lucky. "You've given us the greatest gift we could ever ask for." Lucky wagged his tail, leaning into Sarah's touch. It was a quiet, beautiful moment, one that Emily knew she would carry with her forever. As the day went on, Emily and Lucky made their rounds, visiting the patients and staff who had come to love him. There were tears and hugs, laughter and stories shared. Everyone seemed to understand that this was a farewell, though no one wanted to say the words out loud. When the time came to leave, Emily walked Lucky to the hospital's main entrance. She knelt down beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck as tears streamed down her face. "You've done so much for us," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you." Lucky licked her cheek, his tail wagging gently. Then, with one last look at Emily, he turned and walked out into the world beyond the hospital doors. Emily watched him go, her heart aching with both sadness and gratitude. As she stood there, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. Lucky had come into their lives when they needed him most, and now he was moving on, his mission complete. He had brought hope, healing, and miracles to the hospital, and his legacy would live on in the hearts of everyone he had touched. Emily wiped her tears and smiled, knowing that Lucky's journey wasn't over. Somewhere out there, someone else needed him, and Lucky would be there, ready to bring light into their lives. The morning was unusually quiet, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. Emily walked through the halls with Lucky by her side, as she had done so many times before, but today felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of finality that Emily couldn't quite shake. Lucky, too, seemed more subdued than usual. His steps were slower, his gaze softer, as if he knew something that no one else did. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden glow through the hospital windows. Emily led Lucky to the pediatric ward, where they had started their rounds every morning since he arrived. The nurses greeted them with smiles and a few patients waved from their beds. Lucky wagged his tail gently, offering his usual quiet comfort, but there was a calmness about him that felt different. It was as if he was saying goodbye. When they reached Noah's room, Emily paused. The baby, who had miraculously opened his eyes just days before, was now alert and smiling. His parents, Sarah and Michael, were sitting by his crib, their faces glowing with joy and gratitude. Lucky walked over to the crib and sat down, his tail wagging softly. Noah reached out a tiny hand, and Lucky leaned in, letting the baby's fingers brush against his fur. "Thank you, Lucky," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given us more than we could ever ask for." Michael nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. "You're a miracle worker, buddy. We'll never forget what you've done for our family." Emily watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with pride and sadness. She knelt down beside Lucky, running her fingers through his fur. "You've done so much for everyone here," she said softly. "I don't know how we'll manage without you." Lucky turned his head to look at her, his warm brown eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He licked her hand gently, as if to reassure her. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. She had always known that Lucky's time at the hospital was temporary, but the thought of letting him go was almost too much to bear. As they left Noah's room, Emily noticed that Lucky was walking toward the hospital's main entrance. She followed him, her heart pounding with a mix of emotions. When they reached the doors, Lucky stopped and turned to look at her. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the bond they had formed over the past week speaking louder than any words could. "Are you leaving?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucky wagged his tail slowly, his eyes calm and steady. Emily knelt down beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. Tears streamed down her face as she held him close, her heart aching with both sadness and gratitude. "You've changed everything," she said, her voice trembling. "You've brought hope and love to so many people. I'll never forget you." Lucky licked her cheek, his tail wagging gently. Then with one last look at Emily, he turned and walked out of the hospital doors. Emily watched him go, her vision blurred by tears. His golden fur glowed in the morning sunlight as he trotted down the road, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared from view. For a long time, Emily stood there, unable to move. The hospital felt emptier without Lucky, as if a piece of its soul had left with him. But as she wiped her tears and turned back toward the halls, she realized that Lucky's presence was still there, in the hearts of everyone he had touched. The news of Lucky's departure spread quickly through the hospital. At first, there was a sense of disbelief. How could he be gone? Lucky had become such an integral part of their daily lives that it was hard to imagine the hospital without him. But as the days went on, something remarkable began to happen. The doctors, nurses, and even the patients started to reflect on what Lucky had meant to them. He wasn't just a dog who had wandered into their lives. He was a symbol of hope, resilience, and unconditional love. His quiet presence had reminded them of the importance of compassion, of the power of small acts of kindness to make a difference. Dr. Harris, who had been one of Lucky's most vocal critics, found himself thinking about the golden retriever more often than he cared to admit. He remembered the way Lucky had comforted the young boy in the hallway, the way he had brought a smile to the face of a patient who hadn't smiled in weeks. For the first time in years, Dr. Harris felt a crack in the armor of his rigid professionalism. Lucky had shown him that healing wasn't just about medicine, it was about connection, about seeing the humanity in every patient. One afternoon, as Dr. Harris was reviewing patient charts in his office, he came across a note from a family who had recently been discharged. They had written about how much Lucky's visits had meant to them, how his presence had given them strength during one of the most difficult times of their lives. Dr. Harris set the note down and stared out the window, his mind racing. He had been so focused on rules and regulations that he had almost missed the bigger picture. Lucky had been more than a dog. He had been a healer. In the weeks that followed, the hospital staff began to notice subtle changes in their interactions with patients. Inspired by Lucky's example, they started to go the extra mile to bring comfort and joy to those in their care. Nurses spent a little more time talking with patients, doctors made an effort to connect on a personal level, and even the administrative staff found ways to brighten someone's day. It was as if Lucky's spirit had left an indelible mark on the hospital, a legacy of kindness and compassion that would continue to grow. Emily, too, felt the impact of Lucky's departure in profound ways. She missed him terribly, but she also felt a deep sense of gratitude for the time they had shared. Lucky had taught her to trust her instincts, to fight for what she believed in, and to never underestimate the power of love. She carried those lessons with her every day, finding ways to honor his memory in her work. One evening, as Emily was leaving the hospital, she paused by the main entrance. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the building. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. Lucky might be gone, but his presence was still there, in the smiles of the patients, in the laughter of the staff, and in the quiet moments of connection that made the hospital more than just a place of medicine. As she walked to her car, Emily glanced down the road where she had last seen Lucky. She imagined him out there, bringing hope and love to someone else who needed it. And in that moment, she knew that Lucky's journey wasn't over. He had left the hospital, but his mission continued, spreading light and joy wherever he went. Lucky had been more than a dog. He had been a miracle, a reminder that even in the darkest times there was always hope. And though he was no longer by her side, Emily knew that his legacy would live on, in her heart and in the hearts of everyone he had touched. The day had finally arrived. After weeks of uncertainty, fear, and hope, baby Noah was being discharged from the hospital. The once fragile infant who had spent his earliest days in a coma now sat in his mother's arms, his cheeks rosy and his eyes bright with curiosity. His recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, and the entire hospital staff had gathered to see him off. Emily stood near the entrance, watching as Sarah and Michael prepared to leave with their son. She couldn't help but feel a swell of emotion as she looked at the little boy who had defied all odds. Noah's recovery was something no one could fully explain. The doctors had done everything they could, but even they admitted that his sudden awakening and rapid improvement were beyond the scope of medical understanding. As Sarah approached Emily, tears glistened in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling, "for everything, for bringing Lucky to us. I don't know how, but I know he played a part in this. He gave us hope when we had none." Emily smiled, her own eyes misty. "Lucky had a way of doing that," she replied. She reached out to gently touch Noah's tiny hand, which wrapped around her finger with surprising strength. "He's a fighter, just like his parents." Michael stepped forward, his voice filled with gratitude. "We'll never forget what you and Lucky did for us. You gave us our son back." As the family walked out of the hospital, Emily felt a bittersweet ache in her chest. She was overjoyed for Noah and his parents, but she couldn't help but think of Lucky. He had been there for so many people, offering comfort and hope in ways that no one else could. And now, even though he was gone, his presence was still felt in every corner of the hospital. In the days that followed, Emily found herself reflecting on everything that had happened since Lucky first arrived. She thought about the patients he had comforted, the staff he had inspired, and the lives he had changed. But most of all, she thought about the lessons he had taught her. One afternoon, as she sat in the break room with a cup of coffee, Dr. Harris walked in. He had been quieter than usual since Lucky's departure, and Emily had noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor. He no longer seemed as rigid or dismissive, and there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Emily," he said, sitting down across from her, "I've been thinking a lot about Lucky." Emily raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Oh?" Dr. Harris nodded, his hands clasped in front of him. "I'll admit I was skeptical at first. I didn't see how a dog could have any place in a hospital. But after everything that's happened, after seeing what he did for Noah, for the other patients, I can't deny that he made a difference." Emily smiled, her heart warming at his words. "He did, in ways we can't always explain." Dr. Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That's the part that's hardest for me. I've spent my entire career relying on science, on evidence. But Lucky, he reminded me that not everything can be measured or quantified. Sometimes the most important things are the ones we feel, not the ones we can prove." Emily nodded, her thoughts echoing his. "I've been thinking the same thing. Lucky taught me that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about connection, about love, and about hope. And sometimes, those things are more powerful than anything science can offer." Dr. Harris gave her a small, thoughtful smile. You're right, and I think we could all stand to remember that. As the weeks turned into months, the hospital began to feel like a different place. Lucky's influence lingered, shaping the way the staff approached their work. Inspired by his example, they started to focus more on the emotional and psychological well-being of their patients. Small acts of kindness became a regular part of their routines, bringing a patient their favorite tea, sitting with someone who was lonely, or simply offering a warm smile. Even Dr. Harris, who had once been so focused on rules and protocols, began to change. He started taking more time to talk to his patients, to listen to their stories and understand their fears. He became a quieter, more compassionate presence in the hospital, and the staff couldn't help but notice the difference. Emily, too, found herself changed by her time with Lucky. She had always been a dedicated nurse, but now she approached her work with a deeper sense of purpose. She saw her patients not just as cases to be treated, but as people with hopes, fears, and dreams. And she carried Lucky's lessons with her every day, finding ways to bring a little light into the lives of those around her. One evening, as Emily finished her shift, she found herself drawn to the window in the break room. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. She stood there for a moment, lost in thought, as memories of Lucky filled her mind. She thought about the way he had trotted through the halls, his tail wagging and his eyes full of warmth. She thought about the way he had comforted patients, his presence a balm for their pain and fear. And she thought about the way he had changed her life, teaching her to see the world in a new way. A soft smile spread across her face as she gazed out at the horizon. She didn't know where Lucky was now, but she liked to imagine him out there, bringing hope and love to someone else who needed it. "Thank you, Lucky," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For everything." As she turned to leave, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. Lucky had been more than a dog. He had been a miracle, a reminder that even in the darkest times there was always hope. And though he was no longer by her side, his legacy lived on in the hearts of everyone he had touched. Emily walked out of the hospital that evening with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that life would go on, that there would be new challenges and new patients to care for. But she also knew that Lucky's lessons would stay with her, guiding her in her work and in her life. Because sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the ones we can explain. They're the ones we feel, the ones that remind us of the power of love, connection, and hope. And for Emily, Lucky would always be a symbol of those things, a reminder that even the simplest acts of kindness can change the world.